Welcome. How are you?
How you doing?
I am good, thank you. So this is Michele Silverman Bedell. I welcome you to Instagram, and we're here with Fernando Coates, and we're going to be discussing working with the foreign buyer and investing in New York State real estate. Fernando is an experienced real estate attorney. He's been practicing many years, and he's also multilingual. So he has a lot of experience working with the foreign buyer. You speak Spanish, correct me if I'm wrong, Spanish, French, Italian,
Portuguese.
Portuguese and English, obviously. So he's very well versed in many languages and as well as being a very experienced real estate attorney. So first of all, what qualify? I'll ask you some questions and just feel free to chime in and what who qualifies as a foreign buyer in New York or in the
Well,
United States?
well, thank you, Michelle, for having me on. What the person, quote unquote, who qualifies as a foreign buyer is a non-resident alien, which means someone who has does not have a green card or is not a U.S. citizen. Now, there's some subtleties there. If someone has spent more than 183 days here in this country, there's some income tax issues that arise. But for purpose of what we're talking about now, it's someone who does not have a green card and is not a citizen.
Okay. Why do you think people want to come here and invest in property in New York?
Well, New York, despite the ups and downs of the economy and political issues that arise occasionally, polarization and the like, is a pretty strong market in the sense that it's not a roller coaster market. I am not a real estate broker with your experience, Michelle, but I can tell you that in the history of this country and this city, it generally maintains its value and the values tend to increase.
Right. People, I think, also see it not just to buy a property or a condominium in Manhattan for themselves, but they see it as a long-term investment for the kids who may
Absolutely.
want to study here. Okay. And also, I think commercially, people buy property, not only a residential market, but in the commercial sector as well.
Right. They can do with respect to a development of properties. There was a boom in luxury condos that were built in the past 15, 20 years that attracted a lot of foreign investment, a lot of investment in, for example, in Brooklyn and rehabbing properties for later development and so forth.
Okay. I think it's interesting. Uh, for a foreign buyer coming here, they always want to know the differences between a condominium, a cooperative, or even a townhouse or a HOA. And they really, in their communities, in their countries, very often they're buying a condominium. A co-op is like not even heard of. So maybe you want to just discuss how you explain the differences. I know how I do, but from a legal perspective.
Right. A co-op is a unique piece of property. It's real property, but it isn't. And it really only exists, I think 90% of co-ops are in the New York City region. So most of the country doesn't even know about this. A co-op does not have a deed. What someone
Right.
buys is a share certificate which corresponds to a corporation owns the building that may or may not lease the property, which is another issue in terms of long-term land leases and whatnot. But they own what's called the share certificate, which you have more shares or fewer shares depending on how many floors you are high up and how big the apartment is. It varies. And then they have what's an oxymoron, proprietary lease, which accords rights to the owner through the share certificate. So in terms of real property, it's treated as such, but it isn't because there is no deed, and therefore mortgages technically are not given to co-ops. They're loans, and the UCC one is filed rather than a mortgage. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, as it
Right.
were, but it's very different from a condo, which is you own a piece of that property. One does, and a lot of foreigners enjoy like that. But there are common charges and the like. Whereas a townhouse is one owns the entire building, but depending what they want to use for it, commercial, residential, it can have other complications.
Okay, so it's interesting. It's very different than from if they're buying abroad versus when they buy here. And also, many people don't understand even with a townhouse. They'll think it's a single family. They'll think it's a part of an HOA. It's really a design. It's a style of a home, not necessarily a form of ownership. Correct?
Correct. It's like another word for is brownstone. But the other thing you have to understand, which I know you haven't asked, is that we have title insurance that does not
Correct.
exist abroad. It's a different animal, as it were. They're civil law countries for the most part. And what happens there is that there's someone in Spanish, escribano, or notaire in French, or cartorio in Portuguese. And this person, it's usually an individual who handles the taking in of title, the contracts, and so forth.
Right, right. And also there's not an attorney involved in many of these transactions, I think, right, in South America, or they do have an attorney
They
now.
do have lawyers, but they have a different role. It's not, and especially within this country, they have a different role.
Right.
New York, for example, is an attorney-centered state, which is to my advantage economically, but it's a very
Obviously.
different system compared to Florida.
Right, where the realtors typically write the contract and you close with the title company in most cases, right? It's very different. So
Correct.
it's interesting. In terms of financing, are there any obstacles and how do people transfer money if you're a foreigner coming in from Europe or South America or the Middle East? Does it really differ? Like, what's the mechanism in terms of transferring money in order for them to purchase property here?
Well, that's a long, complex answer, but
Right,
I'll try to break it down. For example, or for to start with, financing is not an issue like it was in the past. The loan to value has increased over time. For a long time, it was very hard for a foreigner to get a loan. Part of the problem is that they have to open an account here, and a lot of people don't want to do that because they're putting money away that could be used for other things. But it's much easier now than it used to be to get financing. The question of transferring funds is something else. There is no limit on the amount of money that can be transferred in the United States. However, anything over $10,000 has to be reported to the IRS. In addition, the banks have made it a little more difficult because they have what's called KYC, know your customer, and they're trying to prevent money laundering, what they call anti-money laundering, AML. So
right.
it has to be done correctly and have to factor in time. A lot of times for closings, I'll tell the clients, why don't you send the money to my escrow account and then we'll make the payments at the time of closing to avoid any problems. However, attorneys, sellers' attorneys, or purchase attorney, escrow accounts don't exist outside the United States for the most part. So that's another
Um,
thing that needs to be explained to the client or the foreign buyer.
right, right. A lot of trust has to go into that as well, right? If they're
Well,
giving you a lot of money to your escrow account.
I've had people tell me in the past they send $1 million from Argentina, for example, to put in my escrow account, and they were scared. I'm
Right,
so many miles away, so there is a lot of trust involved, of course.
right. It's very different probably buying property abroad. They really have to just really understand the process of buying here, not and the mechanism. It's very different in many other countries. I'm sure they don't do inspections. For instance, on a house or a commercial property, they're not used to doing it. They just buy it as is. I know in other countries they do. So they would have to get used to the process of buying.
Right. Although a lot of the due diligence in other countries is done up front. Now you're right. There it's as is, but they still do their due diligence. As opposed to here where due diligence in a residential context, yes, there's an inspection, but the due diligence really comes in with the title insurance later on and all those kind of things. In any case, it is a very different system here. And each state is different here within the United States.
Correct. So on the selling side, I think even agents, realtors don't even understand what FERPTA is. So maybe you could explain that, the process that involves when you're selling the property, it involves the seller or the
A
homeowner.
foreign seller, and usually individual. If it's a company, it's a little different, and they can, if it's a U.S. based company, they won't have to be subject to this. FIRPTA is Foreign Investment Real Property Tax Act, and what that was, the Congress passed that law in the 1980s because a lot of sellers were selling property and they weren't paying the capital gains the following year; they just disappeared. So what Congress decided is that a certain percentage would be collected, or in effect, on behalf of the IRS by the purchaser. And the purchaser has to, rather than pay that X amount of dollars to the seller, they would send it off to the IRS. There's a form that needs prepared, and that form is usually should be prepared by a CPA, and everything needs to be taken care of in advance of the closing, not at the closing. And New York State has something a little similar, which is the IT 2663 and 2664, which applies to co-ops and condos, a percentage is taken out. Now, the thing about the difference between New York State and the IRS is a percentage of the purchase price. So $1 million or more is 15% of the purchase price. Whereas the New York State form applies not just to foreign sellers, anyone who's not a resident of New York State, but as equally so to foreign sellers. And there you can one can calculate and show the gain itself. In other words, increase the basis, show depreciation, and so forth.
Right.
Not with the FERPTA.
Interesting. And that's paid at closing.
Correct. And they have to send it within 2 weeks, 20 days, I forget. And then later on, the foreign seller can apply to the IRS to obtain a refund, partial or total.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that.
But if the
Very,
purchaser doesn't collect it, the purchaser is liable for that tax. So one has to be very careful in that regard.
very interesting. Very interesting. Now, in terms of estate, any estate planning, any how does and the people in terms of an estate purchase, or any estate ramifications when a foreign buyer buys in this country?
Right. The foreign buyer should not buy in his or her own name. That's a
Okay,
cardinal rule because they don't have the exemptions that we have now. $15 million IRS, federal, and I think New York State is 7 million plus. The exemption for a non-resident alien, which goes back to the definition of foreign person, is
right.
$60,000. So if someone owns a foreigner, their own the property in his or her own name, just for the sake of argument, $1 million. If they die owing that amount, the data market value would be $1 million. The tax would be in New York State up to almost 50% or
Oh
$500,000.
my, wow.
So they would have to sell the property, obviously, and pay the tax then. Now, the other way to avoid that legally, and that's what it comes into estate planning for the non-resident alien, is to
Right.
usually the most common method to create an LLC in New York, a New York LLC for the most part, that's owned by an offshore that could be anywhere in the world, in their home country, in the Caribbean, or so forth, because that offshore company, which is owned by the foreign owner, is considered a blocker by the IRS. It's completely legal, but it has to be done correctly, and it's more expensive.
So when they do the purchase, when they buy the property, they're going to own it in an LLC. I mean, Americans do it as well. I mean, most of my clients actually own their properties in the form of an LLC, or in a trust. So, with the foreign buyer, is there any problems doing it in the form of a trust as
No,
well, or
it has to be an
trust is
irrevocable trust, though.
okay,
That's perfectly.
irrevocable?
Yeah, an irrevocable trust has its own mechanisms, and it can be much
Right.
more expensive than setting up an LLC owned by an offshore.
Interesting. So from a broker's perspective, it's very complicated. I mean, obviously you need to work, you seem very well versed in trust and estate law, but it's even complicated to me. I mean, I know a lot of clients of mine own, whether they buy land or or the developers or they buy it personally for themselves, they either buy it in a trust. I'm speaking typically not a co-op, but a trust or they buy it in an LLC.
Correct. Yes,
Right.
but the difference there, the Philip, if you will, with respect to the foreign buyer seller, is that they have to do that to avoid the estate tax, and that's the thing. It's not even estate planning; it's an estate tax for which there is only a $60,000 exemption, which is ridiculous on a property that's could be worth millions.
I mean, I mean, from a realtor's perspective, what can we do to support your efforts in working with the foreign buyer? What can we do? What should we be doing? Anything different than what I normally do when I work with a client, whether they're buying or selling?
Right. Well, as I always say, and I tell people that, especially with the foreign buyer seller, a team is needed. So
Right,
the lawyer should be working in conjunction, hand in hand, as it were, with the real estate broker, and if it's a purchase, with the mortgage broker, and then the title insurance, and a tax expert, a CPA. All these
right,
people, we should be working and be in communication. I know sometimes it's hard. Emails go back and forth, and things are flying because someone wants a contract done, and there's due diligence and whatnot. But we have to be communicative. And the best real estate brokers, like you, Michelle, is that you are telling me, Fernando, there is this such and such person. Oh, okay, good. I need to tell them, if they're a foreign buyer, this is the following structure, because the structures can be put together rather quickly, but not overnight. And
right.
planning has to be done. So the best thing is to have that communication in advance before you even get to the term sheets from which the contracts are generated.
Right. I think even look, whether I work with a foreign buyer or a U.S. citizen, or, no matter, even as somebody who's experienced, often I work with many attorneys who are buying. I explain the process from beginning to end because if they're not doing or if they're not used to buying a property, like I tell them everything I'm doing from beginning to end, explain the process because they often don't understand it and the timing issues. So with a foreign buyer, obviously you have to explain it even in more detail because they don't understand what an assessment is. They don't understand, what the lease is. They don't understand what a co-op is. They don't, or all of these and the pluses and minuses of owning all of this, or what I do when I go to the building department. So it's very important, or any environmental issues. They may
Right.
not even be aware of it. I don't think that comes into play with a co-op or a condo, but clearly when you're buying a home here or a piece of land, environmental issues definitely come into play.
Well,
Underground oil tanks, asbestos, mold, etc.
and you may want to do a phase one, which is not cheap, but it's a good idea a lot of times, depending on where that property is located. If you know it's, for example, it's near oil wells, which it's not common in New York, you would want to do that, obviously. So, or used to be a gas station, and then you would,
Gas station, right,
which has been converted to residential use, the land itself. So yeah, it's very important. So all these things, for example, telling a foreigner they don't realize this, there is no pied-à-terre tax in New York. A lot of countries, for example, they charge a tax, and they've proposed this in New York. It never been passed. That because they're not living here, and of course it goes to the question of pricing and
right,
affordability and whatnot. They want to do this, but we don't have a pied-à-terre tax where there's a percentage charge on the purchase price. We do have the mansion tax though, which
right,
is something different.
right,
And the thing they should also realize is a mortgage recording tax if they take out a mortgage, what New York has and not all states have. So these
right.
things, if the broker's well aware, because usually the first point of contact, I'm not putting this on you as broker, Michelle, or other
No,
broker. You're the
no.
first point of contact. Should have some kind of understanding of this so that when it's explained by the lawyer, it doesn't come as a shock.
No, I also think it's very important to work with somebody, especially if somebody is not well versed in the English language. Like I have somebody now, if they're coming from the Middle East, they really speak English quite well. But I think that they're more comfortable in speaking to somebody who can speak their own language. And you said it's very good because you speak multi-language, you're multilingual, and you also have a background in working with people from the specifically Argentina and South America. So I
Correct.
think that that's very important and very helpful to the foreign buyer who's buying in this country.
Yeah, no,
So,
a lot of it is translation, and not literally, but figuratively, to get the concepts going and being understanding of legal matters and so forth, tax and planning and bank. For example, someone it's not that easy to open a bank account in New York, and maybe a foreigner wants to do that. That explains some of that, what's going on. And I have contacts in banking, and some banks are easier than others, and don't make it such a burden. If they want to have money here in order, for example, to rent the apartment that they bought a condo, and where's that rent going to be paid? It's not going to be sent abroad. It makes no
right,
sense. It should be into a bank account here in New York.
right.
Again, all those things should be explained as much as possible, not in one sitting, but over time to
Obviously,
the
it's
foreigner. And
overwhelming.
yes, I have the advantage. I mean, there are other lawyers like me who are multilingual and from abroad originally, other countries, that I understand the culture, and that helps tremendously.
Right. You have to really understand their mindset because I think they think they view things differently. And for me, I love working with foreign people because I find it just very interesting. I have people now from all over the world, and I personally find it very interesting just to see the way they think and with their responses and how they integrate their family into the process. For me, it's an interesting process as well. But Fernando, I want to thank you so much. You are extremely informative, and I want to thank you for all your help. And hopefully, we'll do this again sometime. And
I
have
would
a
love,
happy Thanksgiving.
and same to you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. You have a great day, Michelle.
You too. Be well.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.